Well, joining me now in the studio is our guest called Mark Skilton, and you are a digital business expert, Mark, at PA Consulting. Thank you very much for coming in. How much use do you think of an intelligence agency to coordinate analysis, do you think, for cyber threats? How useful would that be?
Very useful, because I think if you look at the sort of threats that have come out recently with Sony, that's been quoted as sort of $170 million worth of lost business. An even more bigger issue is with Anthem, that had allegedly 80 million IDs, personal medical records being stolen, quoted again $100 million worth of business. But I would say there's two issues here. There's one around privacy of personal data being lost through data breaches, but also, as Barman's also concerned about, is national security.
So this would be very useful, but realistically, how hard will this be to come about?
Well, the root issue, as I understand it, with the discussions in America at the Stanford conference chaired by Obama, and you've got the likes of Schmidt there, Eric Schmidt, the chairman of Google, also Tim Cook, who's the CEO of Apple, is really around sharing data. There's the liability, who is liable. And I think the problem that they're addressing is looking at some legislation to try and get companies to share. But also, I would say that the issue, certainly with PA Consulting, we talk about cyber governance. You know, companies have got to get more responsibility for encrypting data. But there needs to be changes in the law as well to encourage them to share data, because we need this information to defend ourselves against cyber terrorists, for example.
And how much will, do you think, political will within those companies is there to help the government on this issue? You know, how much does it benefit them? Because you think of it from their perspective and you think that's just more admin for them, that's more expense for them, and it's also, you know, privacy issues for them. So how much are they willing to help the government to provide this information?
The issue is only going to get worse, because if you look at the size of the internet now, we're talking about zettabytes of data, the explosion of information, which is all good in some respects. It's giving us potentially more capabilities to live our lives, to share information. But there is a downside about privacy, about protection, about vulnerable people in society, and also things like that, but also growing the economy. So companies have this kind of double-edged standard, or a paradox, if you will, of in order to generate more revenue, more business, they've got to share information to transact and work in that world. So I think there's a kind of trade-off here that companies are going to need new laws, which is what we're talking about in Stanford in the West Coast, but also there needs to be some encouragement to make it law, make them comply to that. And I think this is the right step. This is the step in the right direction.
Potentially one of the catalysts for this summit that we've seen was the hack on Sony, allegedly by North Korea. How credible do you think it was, or how likely do you think it was that North Korea were behind it?
I commented on this at the time, and at the time it looked like it was an insider job, to put it bluntly, in terms of the way that it seemed to have been perpetrated. But the CIA came up with some views that the actual network routing, again, I don't have access to the actual data, was coming from North Korea. Now, the issue isn't, I don't think, whether they did it or not. I think it's just a concern of being able to monitor, to track. And Sony is a multi-billion-dollar organization. And if they cannot, I mean, they had a cyber attack in 2011. You would have thought they would have fixed the problem then. But here we are in 2015, still discussing the same problem. It's a continuous war, as I was saying earlier. It's a continuous war where you've got to keep ahead of the cyber attacks. You've got to keep legislation moving forward. As technology races ahead, law and protection and society has to move forward with it.
And potentially law, protection and society have been a bit slow on the uptake. Let's just mention a few people that weren't there, or a few groups that weren't there at this summit. There was Yahoo, Google, a number of other big players missing. Why do you think that was? Is that somehow a kind of different take on it than Washington?
Probably not. I think this is a discussion conference, sort of exploring the options. I think they're bringing in some big speakers, clearly the names I just mentioned earlier. But I think obviously Facebook has got 1.3 billion accounts at the last count. And I think what's happening here is around sharing. And if you look at the major companies like Apple, like Google, they are companies that need to set some standard for the rest, as well as other companies coming into that kind of. It's an ecosystem, if you will, where if you have one area that's weak, then the rest of the ecosystem is weaker as a result. And this is one of the new mindsets of the 21st century as we head off into the second half of the next decade. We've got to think in a more pluralistic way. And this is quite different from the old world of the previous century, where you can kind of, I've got it on my hard server, and I can control my data. The problem is we don't know where the boundary is anymore. We've got to learn how to think in a broader sense. And that's quite a challenge for governments, for you and I, when we go home or we're using information in the media such as this. We have to have a new set of standards, a new way of thinking. And the issue is you can be good for the power of good, monitoring vulnerable people in society, improving healthcare and things like this, but also it can also be a power of some evil in terms of cyberbullying, in terms of cyber threats, the Snowden affair that blew this up in the first place. There's a lot of new things going on, and trying to keep track of it all. As I said, government can't do this themselves. They've got to work with industry.
All very interesting, all very complex. Mark Skilton from PA Consulting, thank you very much indeed for coming in.